Chapter 236 of Jujutsu Kaisen recently released, and with it came the conclusion to the battle between the strongest. Satoru Gojo and Ryomen Sukuna's deathmatch in Shinjuku, ultimately resulting in the death of the most beloved character in the story. A highly contentious decision which has led to some of the most heated debates within the community. I myself absolutely adored the chapter. It is without a doubt my favourite thing Gege has written in the story thus far, and has cemented Gojo as the best character in Jujutsu Kaisen for me. A perfectly calculated end for the man who lived his life never truly knowing who he was, only coming to terms with that fact on his deathbed. Today I hope to deliver a comprehensive viewing of Satoru Gojo, to get to know the man who didn't truly know himself, the self-proclaimed god of Jujutsu Kaisen. Satoru was born to be the strongest. His birth alone shifted the balance of the Jujutsu world. Curses evolved in strength because of Gojo's existence. As the benchmark of cursed energy potential, he facilitated their growth. On the day of his birth, a bounty of over 100,000 was already placed on his head. As a second year in Jujutsu High, he was already famed for his unparalleled strength, destined for immense power by virtue of things completely outside of his own control. To be born into the Gojo clan, to possess the family's curse technique as well as the Six Eyes, is not something one can achieve out of individual merit or even desire. You are either born this way or you are not, and Satoru Gojo was born that way. Born special as the first wielder of both Limitless and the Six Eyes in over 100 years, he had everything given to him at birth. Six Eyes that allow him to see through all things related to cursed energy. Limitless that allows him to manipulate space to such an extreme extent that he is capable of creating things that are technically impossible as per the rules of physics. Gojo's abilities aside, his first name even points towards this status as an enlightened being in comparison to his peers. Satoru is the base of the term Satori, which translates to enlightenment in Zen Buddhism. That is what I mean when I say he's handed everything at birth. It's not just his ridiculous powers granted to him by being born as a member of the Gojo clan, but the implications of such powers. The resultant destiny to stand at the pinnacle of society. To such an extent he considers himself peerless throughout the heavens and the earth. But can we truly say that Gojo was simply fated to be this way? That he never fought and struggled to maintain this position at the top? I don't think we can. I don't think it's anywhere near that clear cut. There are both elements of a preordained fate as well as Satoru's own will that constitute his position as the strongest. A widespread commonality between figures who stand at the very top of their respective institutions is the loneliness that comes with being the very best. To be number one is to be the only one. To stand at the top means to look down on everybody else. It is inherently singular and isolated by nature, a lonely position that only one person can fulfill. And in the current generation of Jujutsu society, Satoru Gojo is that person. It takes a literal legend from history, an existence that is unnaturally summoned into the current era to challenge Gojo's position at the top. When asked how he came up with the character of Satoru Gojo in the Jujutsu Kaisen fanbook, Akutami responded by saying he wanted Gojo to serve as the undisputed power ceiling of the story. He was created to serve this role as the strongest. It is undoubtedly the core of Satoru Gojo, wherein every other element of his character ultimately feeds into this central idea. Satoru Gojo is defined by this position, at the summit of Jujutsu society. The strongest is everything he has ever known. Are you Satoru Gojo because you're the strongest, or are you the strongest because you're Satoru Gojo? This is arguably the single most important line in the story concerning Gojo's character, a conundrum regarding the rift between fate and free will. Is Gojo a moral agent choosing to live his life the way he does, accommodating this position of a necessary figurehead for sorcerers and maintaining balance within Jujutsu society out of his own volition? Or is Gojo accommodating that position simply as a result of his fate, because he was born with special abilities, the Limitless, the Six Eyes? Does that make him destined to fulfill this role? Is Gojo just another necessary cog in the world of Jujutsu sorcerers that was placed there by design, or is he consciously choosing to live his life the way he does? In simple terms, is Gojo who he is because of what he's capable of, or is he capable of that because of who he is? An incredibly necessary distinction that completely goes over Satoru's head. Gojo's loneliness is a direct result of this identity crisis. His powers of the Limitless and the Six Eyes are inseparable from his position as the strongest. Without them, Gojo would not be the pinnacle. They are the single most defining aspect of his identity as the strongest. These special God-given abilities he was born with both allow and necessitate Gojo to accommodate this role as the strongest. Existing in a separate realm to his peers, the power ceiling of the verse, the pinnacle of the Jujutsu world, the balancer of society's power struggle, alone and unchallenged at the top. This is reflected in how his powers don't just isolate Gojo in a metaphorical sense, but a very literal sense also. When the Limitless is active, Gojo can never touch people, and neither can he be touched. He physically cannot get close to others. He can never truly open up to them so long as he depends on this power. The most crucial point being the fact he can deactivate the Limitless if he so wishes. He can touch people and get close to them, but in doing so he is losing his defining powers. For that short moment, he isn't the strongest. He isn't Satoru Gojo. We can take this even further by examining Satoru's domain expansion and how that functions as an allegory to his entire existence. Unlimited Void summons the target inside the Limitless itself, a vast void of infinite knowledge, which explains the name, Unlimited Void. Sounds paradoxical, right? Boundless raw information floods into the target's mind, overwhelming them to the point they're completely immobilized, frozen in time. Gojo himself addresses the irony in his own power when he first uses it against Jogo. The victim is given everything, but unable to do anything with it. They are left powerless precisely because the flurry of information they've been exposed to is so unbelievably overwhelming. All they can do is die slowly. And since Gojo conjoins knowledge and power through the use of his domain, we can see the real irony lies in how its functionality speaks to Gojo's dilemma. He has all the power in the world, but he is incapable of freeing himself from the suffering and loneliness it brings. He is suffering and lonely precisely because of that power. They are inseparable states of being. That is why the strongest sorcerer, the pinnacle of the Jujutsu world, places all of his stocks into fostering the next generation to be the ones that can fundamentally change this broken society, instead of directly doing anything himself. On one hand, he wants to raise these individuals to one day match him and thus free him from the isolation of unparalleled power, and on the other hand, he isn't proactive in making this a reality. Perhaps he likes being the strongest more than he knows. Perhaps he doesn't know what he wants. What makes analyzing Gojo so difficult is that he is an enigma not just to the reader, but to himself. What goes on in his head? It's tough to discern, but one thing is for sure. There are two sides to everything about Satoru Gojo. There's even a metatextual layer to Satoru's internal conflict when we factor in the reason why he was even created by Akutami. As I previously stated, Gojo was made to be the undisputed power ceiling of the verse, something he has never had any control over. Satoru was born to be this way in the story and was created to be this way for the story. This is especially noteworthy when you consider what Jujutsu Kaisen is even about on a thematic level. Time and time again, Akutami has made it very clear that this is a story about individual agency, to overcome your inherent surroundings by embracing and staying true to your own will. When characters stray from their own desires and submit to what is expected of them, they suffer. We see this with Yuji's cog mentality and how he is beaten down time and time again. We see this with Yuki, who relied on a strategy that involved the input of both Tengen and Choso instead of doing things her own way, and for that she paid the ultimate price of her own life. The inverse is also true, with characters being rewarded for sticking true to themselves. Maki is the prime example in our protagonists, a character who breaks free from the destiny of Jujutsu sorcerers in countless ways. She breaks free from the Zenin clan, quite literally eradicating the entire family. And arguably most importantly, she breaks free from the shackles of cursed energy. To explain what I mean, we'll have to take a slight tangent that I promise will pay off in the context of Satoru Gojo. What is the nature of cursed energy? It's a question with no real answer. Something that has been obscured since the very beginning of the story. A power source aligned with negative emotions, but why exactly do these emotions manifest into power? And does that incredibly vague description explain the countless creative and almost abstract applications of the power system? I don't think it does, and I'm almost certain that the only people in the story who truly understand the nature of cursed energy are Master Tengen, Ryomen Sukuna, and perhaps Kenjaku. But so far, I do believe we have received more than enough information to extrapolate from. The most interesting use of cursed energy is Higuruma's domain expansion. Deadly sentencing is by far the most unique domain we've seen in the story thus far, which is rather ironic because it's described to be more of a classical domain. A courtroom is manifested, and instead of providing a guaranteed hit like most of the domains in the current generation, instead anybody within the domain is simply forced to follow its rules. And here's the kicker: Higuruma's Shikigami, Judgeman, knows everything about everyone inside the domain. Higuruma himself does not have access to the information, but his Shikigami, which is by nature an incarnation of cursed energy, somehow does. Judgeman is privy to such precise, accurate information, it really makes you wonder what the extent of cursed energy's capabilities are. It knows the exact date, time, and location of Yuji entering a pachinko parlor despite being underage at the time. It even somehow manifests photographic evidence of Yuji from a local security camera. This introduces an objective element to cursed energy, as Judgeman is nigh omniscient, and it feeds into Master Tengen's description of Toji as an anomaly who had escaped from cursed energy, a human being who escaped fate through the power of restriction, the man who broke us free from our destinies. All of this points to cursed energy within Jujutsu Kaisen as something inextricably connected to fate itself, whatever that may mean. As of right now, we cannot understand what kind of force fate in Jujutsu Kaisen is. Is it a timeline of predetermined events, a spiritual force, or something else entirely? We cannot know, but what we can know is that there is something inherently shackling about cursed energy. It is depicted as chains, and Toji and Maki, who have no cursed energy, are said to have broken free from its shackles. What does this all mean for Satoru Gojo, the man at the pinnacle of Jujutsu society, the strongest sorcerer, or scratch that, the strongest user of cursed energy in the modern era, the man whose eyes force him to view the world solely through cursed energy? As I previously explained, Gojo's identity as the strongest is inseparably tied to his abilities, his cursed techniques, and ultimately his cursed energy. When Satoru was born, curses started to grow stronger, like when a seemingly unbeatable track and field record gets broken, or when figure skaters suddenly have to add more spins to their jumps due to a single athlete's prowess. This is just one aspect of Gojo that ties into his fate of being the strongest from birth. His competition, his enemies, his victims grew in strength to accommodate him as the balancer of society, to ensure he reaches the heights he was destined for, and to serve as worthy counteracting forces in society. Most importantly though, are Satoru Gojo's 6 eyes, the eyes that allow him to perceive the inner workings of cursed energy to such an extreme degree, he is forced to cover them with sunglasses or blindfolds, or else the overflow of information would be too much for his mind to handle. The eyes that bind him to the generational fate of opposing Kenjaku, the eyes that give him everything, and precisely because of that, rob him of the capacity to do anything. This conflict between Satoru's fate and his own will that is present in all aspects of Gojo's characterization is expressed primarily through another idea, the idea of perception. After all, everybody lives in their own heads to some degree. How one views things is almost always more important than what they are actually viewing. This is especially true in the case of Satoru Gojo. Since perception is inherently linked with sight, let's take a deeper look at what the six eyes actually mean for Gojo. Akutami distinctly explains how these all-powerful eyes function in the Jujutsu Kaisen fanbook. To put it bluntly, the six eyes allow the user to see cursed energy in extreme detail. Gojo's vision is akin to high-resolution thermography. Even when he's wearing his blindfold, he can even recognize things that don't have cursed energy, like buildings, through the residue and flow of cursed energy that circumvents them. He wears a blindfold to conserve his energy, despite constantly using reverse curse technique to keep his brain fresh. That is how overwhelming the influx of information that Gojo is privy to really is. And lastly, if an ordinary person were to wear Gojo's sunglasses, they wouldn't be able to see anything aside from pitch blackness. This essentially renders Gojo blind and simultaneously all-seeing. Gojo cannot see things like normal people. His six eyes are fundamentally wired to view the world through cursed energy, and by virtue of his position as the strongest, a sorcerer who is constantly being targeted, he feels the need to keep the six eyes active at all times. Hence why I call Gojo blind. He can't see the world from a human perspective. The lens through which he views the world is defined by cursed energy. He cannot see the faces around him. He cannot see their expressions. He cannot look at them in the same way they look at him, so long as he is wearing the blindfold or sunglasses that obstruct his sight. From this, we can draw an interesting contrast between Gojo and Maki, two characters whose perception of the world around them is very crucial. Maki wore special glasses to venture into the world of curses, to extend her sight, whereas Gojo wears pitch black sunglasses or a blindfold to obstruct his sight, allowing him to remain in the world of curses without placing himself in harm's way. The loneliness Gojo feels at the top of Jujutsu society has heavily impacted his perception of what being a sorcerer even entails. His past experiences, the loss of his friends and loved ones, these things have crafted this mindset of strength in solitude, to be isolated, to be cold and distant from everybody else for their sake. By virtue of Gojo's fighting style, the nature of his abilities, others would simply get in his way, and thus he views Jujutsu sorcery as an individual sport. No matter how many allies you have around you, when you die, you'll be alone. Before we dive into what I believe is the single most important section of Gojo's life and character writing, I want to address something I think is very important and very overlooked. Satoru Gojo loves being strong. He loves the thrill of sheer dominance over his adversaries. He enjoys beating the shit out of curses. Just look at his face in this panel, or this panel. He's having the time of his life. And can we blame him? Imagine having absolute power and believing that you're using this power in the name of good. That would get to anybody's head. And therein lies the beautiful contradiction of Gojo's existence. The opposing forces at play. The loneliness at the top, the desire for somebody to understand him and serve as his equal, whilst simultaneously clinging to this position at the top, reveling in battle. Satoru is both satisfied and frustrated by the solitude of being at the top. But it wasn't always this way. There was one period in Gojo's life where he wasn't lonely, where he had somebody he could confide in and open up to. Before he became the mass-murdering villain who wished to eradicate humanity, Suguru Geto was the model sorcerer, the voice of reason, a righteous, disciplined young man living in what he perceived to be his ideal world. Gojo, on the other hand, was nothing like that. He was a chaotic youth who constantly questioned various aspects of the society he lived within. But even so, there are cracks to both of these personas. In their interactions with the Q soldiers, we see that Gojo is a lot kinder than he seems, and Geto is a lot more brutal than he seems. Gojo offers to spare the life of his enemy if at any point in their fight he cries or apologizes, and contrastingly, Geto's enemy is seen begging for mercy, and despite claiming to be this upstanding individual, Geto is just chilling whilst using his curse to harass and make the enemy uncomfortable. Another example of this is when Geto displays genuine concern for Riko's emotions and supports her spending time at school. Despite the potential risks this poses to the stability of the entire world, Geto's ideal world, if she is killed. Gojo, on the other hand, is way more mission oriented, with his eyes set on the objective. The exemplary sorcerer is focusing on the girl's feelings, whilst the misfit is focused solely on the objective. A lot of contrasts between these two. It is through this dynamic between Gojo and his best friend that we can learn so much about him. They have a love-hate relationship in the sense that they're always butting heads and fighting, but at the end of the day there's nobody in the world that they trust more than the other. They care about one another very deeply, and due to their immense strength and how that constitutes their joint position of being the strongest together, it creates an equal split between them. They are two halves of a single whole, until of course Satoru Gojo evolves. At this point in his life, Gojo is nowhere near his full potential. He couldn't use the reverse curse technique or keep infinity stable for long periods of time, let alone use red and blue whenever he wanted. The limitless was fallible. He did not exist in a literal untouchable realm just yet. He could open up to people and get close to them. And that was for the best, because for the only time in his life, he had an equal. He had someone he could trust with his life. He felt safe with Suguru. Together he felt they were unstoppable. The only person to ever treat him like a normal person was Suguru Geto. And this is even more impactful when you consider the kind of childhood Gojo very likely had. When discussing with Geto about the possibility of Riko not being prepared to sacrifice herself, it was Gojo who said that they would call it off. He was prepared to live a life on the run to protect an innocent girl's childhood. One of the only times in the story we see Gojo visibly distressed is when he thinks Yuji had been killed. He lets him go to the Goodwill because he doesn't want Yuji's best years to be robbed of him. The importance of preserving the youth of kids is a sentiment we see from Gojo time and time again, and I propose that this sentiment is rooted in his own childhood experiences, the fact he wasn't able to have a proper childhood. From the moment of his birth he was targeted, and so he most likely had a very sheltered, secluded youth in hiding. The burden of responsibility was on Gojo's shoulder even in his formative years. The world around him viewed him as one of two things, a devil or a savior. He was defined by the fact he was born with the combination of the Gojo family's two prized abilities, not as an individual. And so when he grew up and met Suguru Geto, he finally found somebody who viewed him as more than just the strongest, as an actual individual, as Satoru Gojo. He was temporarily relieved of the burden of his life's fate, until a certain assassin, who ironically is later described to have broken the shackles of destiny, isolates Gojo once more, bringing back his burden and fate of being the sole strongest. Again, Gojo's powers, which function as an extension of his identity as the strongest, beautifully display the rift that grows between him and Geto. We can view his bond with Geto as a representation of Gojo's humanity, the only real bond he's ever had. And at that time of his life, he was far from achieving his full potential. But once Toji came into the picture, Gojo evolved. He reached a level of power that Geto couldn't hope to contend with. His limitless became permanently active, meaning he physically couldn't touch others. His six eyes also became permanently active, as he learned to utilize the reverse curse technique and could thus constantly heal his brain and prevent it from frying. As Gojo grew in power and Geto remained stagnant, the rift between himself and Geto continued to grow. Gojo is in his element when he's alone, and so he took on missions by himself, leaving Geto alone with his chaotic thoughts that slowly but surely consumed him. I want to take a closer look at Gojo's perceived enlightenment in his battle against Toji and sort of bring it into question. That iconic page of him pointing to the ground and the sky and proudly proclaiming that throughout heaven and earth he alone is the honored one. This is a clear reference to the Buddha, as the Honored One is one of his many names. It's said that after he was born, the Buddha took 7 steps from his mother, pointed to both heaven and earth, and proclaimed himself as the Honored One. For Gojo, this obviously doesn't happen at birth, but rather 17 years into his life. One could argue that this is Gojo's rebirth after tasting death and finally understanding the core of cursed energy, thus making the reference valid. But I think there's a layer of irony to Gojo's perceived enlightenment. The first point would be the very fact he's quoting someone else's words, which feeds into his lack of self. Then there's the fact that shortly after this, Gojo immediately bounces back from doing things his own way to asking for Geto's approval. He doesn't kill the Tengen worshippers despite wanting to, because Geto claims a sorcerer does not kill without a reason. This points to Gojo not truly being enlightened, as that would suggest the capacity to do as one wishes to. Instead, he succumbs to Geto's philosophy, which itself is incredibly shaky due to what he just experienced. I believe that Gojo's perceived enlightenment is actually a display of his arrogance. Not that Satoru remains egotistical at all times, but that in a few select moments, he does succumb to a sense of superiority over those around him. And in this moment, he is at the height of his arrogance, having just overcome death itself, having reached new levels when he was already considered the strongest. Gojo is drunk on his newfound power. We learn from Todo in the Goodwill that cursed energy exists in mind, body, and soul. The way Satoru is fighting, with no proper stance or uniformity, but rather flowing freely, reflects that idea perfectly. Gojo is reveling in this battle. He is having the time of his life and embracing the moment wholly. He apologizes to Riko not for failing to save her, but rather because he isn't fighting to avenge her. Instead, he's fighting for the thrill. He doesn't have the time or care for extraneous thoughts or any focus on anything else whatsoever. He's purely living in the moment. It's crazy to think that to reach this level, to truly become the strongest, Satoru Gojo had to strip himself of his humanity. It's sad but also very fitting, as Jujutsu Society does not care for Gojo as a human being. They only care for him as the strongest. His best friend begins to transform right under his nose and he fails to notice. In every interaction between these two throughout the arc, Gojo is wearing his pitch black sunglasses, an obstruction of his sight, his human senses. He never got to see his best friend for what he was. He never saw that his best friend was changing for the worse. And so when Geto finally reaches his breaking point, murdering a village of non-sorcerers and being brandished a criminal subject to execution, Gojo finally sees him for the first time, without his glasses. The symbol of his human blindness is no longer there. He sees Geto for the first time as a monster, the man who didn't just betray Jujutsu Society, but his best friend also. Are you the strongest because you're Satoru Gojo, or are you Satoru Gojo because you're the strongest? Are you an individual human being who willfully chooses to live his life the way he does, or are you just another necessary cog in the machine that is Jujutsu Society, fulfilling a role that was destined for you? Beyond the stuff I previously explained regarding fate and free will, an aspect of this line that truly stings is that Geto, the one who had always seen Gojo as a human being above all else, is the one to have said this. He dehumanizes Gojo for the first time ever. Geto's betrayal of Gojo isn't limited to his defection, but even their friendship, which had always been defined by the fact that Geto viewed him as a normal human being when everybody else viewed him as either a devil or a savior. But in the end, even Geto calls into question Gojo's individual identity outside of being the strongest. The blue spring of Satoru Gojo's youth comes to a close. I believe that following this moment, Gojo clings to the Geto before the fateful nights that changed him. The upstanding model sorcerer who considers it his duty to protect the weak. The representation of Satoru's humanity, Suguru Geto, who came from a family of non-sorcerers and lived to do the right thing. driven by reason and a sense of justice. Suguru Geto, whose philosophies Gojo had only heard and never truly saw. From this moment on, Gojo attempted to embody the qualities of his best friend before the descent. Not in terms of disposition or personality, as of course Gojo's very different to Geto, but definitely in terms of philosophy. This is why he wishes to reshape the very structure of Jujutsu society, and this only further adds to his lack of self, his inefficacy to be the agent of his own life. Gojo's greatest failure was ascending so close to the heavens that in the process he lost his only friend and with that, his humanity. From that moment on, he became defined by his power. What's most noteworthy with regards to Gojo's identity as the strongest is the fact he's not just the strongest. This is evidenced countless times, but a perfect example is in the bonus sketches for chapter 88, where his peers and students share their thoughts on the man. Yes, Gojo is epitomized by his position as the strongest. It's the one thing that everybody in society considers him as, from his friends to his enemies, but it's not the only thing he is. He's a teacher, a savior, an idiot, salmon even. But he's still shackled to this identity of simply being the strongest cog due to his own incapacity to view himself as anything more. Gojo's greatest enemy is himself, his own perception. He fails to recognize that he is in fact more than just the strongest, that he has these emotional bonds and people depending on him for the person he is. It's what Gojo takes away that matters. Since those high school days, he has externalized that singular aspect of himself that he associates all his worth with, and he wears this strength as his identity. Everything about this first portion of Shibuya is methodically constructed to wear Gojo down. As I've said countless times throughout the video, and as Gege has made it clear countless times throughout the story, Satoru Gojo is the strongest, and that begs the question, how do you defeat the strongest? Gojo is lured into the lowest level of Shibuya Station, which is filled with thousands of passengers who are trapped inside. And through a flashback, Kenjaku establishes that Satoru Gojo is in his element when he is alone, with no extra baggage to consider. This speech bubble being drawn as a literal bubble is something that substantiates the villain's plans as well as Gojo's fragility when he's around others. They will prevent Gojo from being able to go all out by involving thousands of human baggage. He will burst under the pressure of his circumstances. On top of that, they indiscriminately kill those humans in an attempt to attack Gojo, something Gojo considers stupid since they're wasting their only advantage, but ironically the all-seeing fails to see beyond the surface. The point of placing these humans here is not just to prevent Gojo from going all out. Of course, that's one of, if not the most important reason for it, but another incredibly important factor is the effect this will have on Gojo's mind. The strong exist to protect the weak, right? So what's the point of being the strongest if countless people are dying and you're incapable of protecting them? Gojo is being tested. Not physically, but psychologically. His position as the strongest is being called into question. Again, not physically, but ideologically. And so under the extreme pressure of Mahito's arrival with the train of transfigured humans, Gojo pulls his all or nothing gamble. A domain expansion of 0.2 seconds. Not only does Gojo kill every single transfigured human who had been released from the train, but the domain expansion was timed perfectly so that he wouldn't kill any of the civilians, but rather send them to rehab for a couple of months. The gamble worked. Gojo proved himself the strongest, but the mental strain of this decision, alongside what follows, is exactly what seals Gojo's fate. He had no way of knowing this gamble worked. For all he knew, Gojo had just killed all of the innocent civilians in the train station, as the time frame he chose was merely conjecture. And had it all gone terribly wrong, he would have to suffer the consequences. And that is exactly when the prison realm is opened. Gojo gazes upon the eye of the prison realm, and where his face should be, the defining aspect of a person's identity, is nothing but a void. emptiness. Satoru Gojo is the strongest, and that identity is what shapes his entire existence, or at least that is how he perceives it. As I said, what Gojo takes away is most important. Gojo thinks that he isn't really viewed as an individual person, but rather a necessary figurehead, epitomized by this position as the strongest, a shell of a man lacking any real essence. And in his final moments before being sealed, he is forced to gaze into this perception of himself in what is one of Gege's most impressive pages in the entire manga. And all he can do is run, flee from himself, flee from what he thinks of himself. Unfortunately, the man he was under the impression he had killed with his own hands was ready to greet him. The sole condition of using the prison realm is that Gojo must stay within a 4-meter radius for an entire minute for it to activate. A condition that sounded so impossible, Jogo lost his mind when he first learnt about it. But Kenjaku is not stupid. Upon seeing the face of his best friend, the memories of Gojo's student days immediately set off in his mind and freeze him on the spot. The Six Eyes allow Gojo to process extremely large amounts of information at lightning fast speeds, and so in this split second, Gojo's mind was going through the memories of his entire high school years. It's not a literal minute, but rather a perceived minute that is needed for the prison realm to activate. Rather ironic that Gojo's greatest trait, the eyes that define his identity, were ultimately a major contributor to his downfall. Not just his six eyes, but Limitless also, as the effect of seeing Geto has an effect on Gojo's mind eerily reminiscent of Unlimited Void. Given everything, but incapable of doing anything with it. Frozen in the moment. There's a certain poetic connotation in the Japanese version of this quote that is almost impossible to properly convey in English, due to the differences in the nature of both languages. I've left a link to a Reddit thread in the description that goes to extreme lengths to explain the nuances in the Japanese version, but I'll give a brief explanation here. In this panel, youth is worded as Aoi Haru, which is usually a poetic way of referring to one's youth. Its literal meaning is blue spring, where Aoi means blue and Haru means spring. Hence why I titled the previous section of the video Satoru Gojo's Blue Spring. The youth equals springtime analogy also ties into the cover for chapter 100 with the blooming cherry blossom tree in the background. Cherry blossoms are closely associated with spring as these flowers signal the arrival of the season in Japan. The blossoms only last for a few days, but it's precisely their fleeting nature that makes them so special. This is also very likely a reference to the manga by Taiyo Matsumoto titled Blue Spring, which later received a live-action adaptation. A story about two boys in high school who happen to be the best of friends, but things happen and they grow apart. Given Gege's track record for incorporating movie references in the manga, I really doubt that this is a coincidence. As previously explained, the importance of preserving the youth of kids is a sentiment that's been expressed by Gojo on numerous occasions. It's a major motivation behind looking out for kids like Yuji, Yuta, Megumi, and it's also why he was prepared to live life as a fugitive if Riko wasn't prepared to sacrifice herself. Geto shares a brief conversation with Kenjaku, questioning his identity and remaining steadfast in his belief that this is not his best friend. This is not Suguru Geto. The term he specifically uses is "My six eyes tell me you're Suguru Geto, but my soul knows otherwise." This idea of Gojo discerning Geto's identity via his soul, when he is almost exclusively known as the all-seeing who uses the six eyes to comprehend everything in front of him, further adds to this identity crisis. The years spent with Geto was the time when Gojo was most in tune with his soul, the time when he was most human, as his relationship with Geto alleviated him of the burden of being this senseless cog to be used for Jujutsu society. And thus Gojo is placed into a realm of darkness, where not even time exists. Balance is broken, society is in tatters, and Gojo leaves everything in the hands of his students. After countless tragedies, Satoru Gojo is finally unsealed from the prison realm. Only 19 days had passed since he was sealed, but to him it probably felt like an eternity. Physical time doesn't flow in the prison realm, meaning you can't die from causes related to time, such as hunger and old age. Why is it then that despite Angel describing this as something potentially detrimental to Gojo's mental state, he comes out exactly the same way he always was? The fact this isn't even addressed is something people have criticized criticized heavily, but I wonder, why would Gege even bother including Angel's explanation and have Gojo's unsealing take place in a training ground with everybody taking cover if there wasn't going to be some sort of follow-up? Well, that's the point. The fact that Gojo largely remained the same speaks to his experiences outside of the prison realm. Perhaps his experiences in this void of darkness surrounded by death with the weight of the world on his shoulders, incapable of doing anything about it, isn't so different from his experiences outside of the prison. Life as the strongest sorcerer is itself imprisoning. I don't want to spend much time talking about Gojo vs Sukuna as a fight and even as a dynamic, as I'm planning to make a video specifically on the topic. There are some things we have to address though, as they are tied to some of Gojo's most crucial characterization. These two men, defined by their positions as the strongest of different eras, share countless similarities, but it is their contrasts that speak volumes. Gojo desires bonds, to raise a generation of sorcerers who can contend with him in order to alleviate the burden of being the sole strongest and the loneliness that comes with it. This is completely antithetical to Sukuna's philosophy, the calamity who disregards everyone else out of an intense love for himself. He has an unquenchable sense of self. He firmly grasps everything he desires by burning everything else to a cinder. Earlier in the video I spoke about how Gege has consistently promoted a strong sense of individual agency, how characters are constantly suffering because they don't have a firm grasp over their identities, and how the inverse is also true. Sukuna is the ultimate benchmark of this idea, a character constantly rewarded by the story for his extreme sense of self, and Gojo is the inverse, constantly suffering due to the selfless decisions he makes. Gojo can be selfish. He was at his absolute best when selfish, but he willingly chose to live a harder life, to try and cling to his humanity despite perceiving himself as this senseless figurehead to be used for the good of society. It's very intentional that Sukuna uses the abilities of others, existing in this current era as a parasitic host, a curse from the past, whilst Gojo is the strongest alone and uses only the abilities he was given at birth. Bonds with others are a hindrance for Gojo due to the way his powers work and, most importantly, how much he cares for them, whereas Sukuna cares for nobody but himself. Gojo caring about how cool he looks in front of his students further ties into this idea of solitude versus bonds, where Sukuna couldn't care less about how he's viewed, and Gojo does care, as he considers it his duty to foster the new generation and serve as their guiding light to reform Jujutsu society. There is irony in both Gojo and Sukuna's respective positions as the strongest, how they both cling to this position whilst actively doing things that call it into question, like Sukuna depending on Mahoraga to evolve to even greater heights, and Gojo destroying the inverted spear of heaven and the black rope, the only two cursed tools that can threaten his position as the strongest. We can even look into his care for Megumi. Why would Gojo entertain a request from someone like Toji? Of course, there's the element of Gojo's kindness at play, but there's also the fact that Megumi, as someone who has inherited the Zenin family's curse technique, could one day threaten his position at the top. He wants to nurture Megumi, but in his own way. These bonds play an instrumental role in the fight against Sukuna. After activating Unlimited Void, Gojo had the perfect opportunity to kill the King of Curses, to take his own advice and take the Demon King's head off. But instead, he punches him through the chest, because deep down, he doesn't want to kill Megumi. He is fighting for a way to both win and save Megumi from the parasite that has taken control over him. Ultimately, Gojo loses this battle of the strongest. The side of him that always wanted to be alleviated of the burden of his life's fate is satisfied. By being outmatched by Sukuna, by having his inferiority clearly and unquestionably displayed, Gojo is finally freed from his identity crisis. That's why he's shown as his younger self, his freest and most human self, in the purgatory/vision of his death. And that is why there are cherry blossoms throughout the chapter. As previously stated, cherry blossoms signal the season of spring in Japan. The blossoms last only for a few days, but it's precisely their momentary nature that makes them so special. In this final, fleeting moment of Gojo's life, he is reborn as simply Satoru Gojo. He is no longer the strongest for this split-second moment. He is finally free, and thus he dies smiling. Sukuna challenged everything Gojo existed to represent and came out on top. He proved that Satoru wasn't the strongest, at least not anymore, and so he can finally be simply Satoru Gojo in death. In Hidden Inventory, we get this moment between Gojo and Geto that is, once again, completely lost in translation. Geto is telling Gojo to be more mindful of the way he talks, particularly around his superiors. In Japanese, there's a lot more to this. Geto asks Gojo to stop using ore to refer to himself and use boku instead. Generally, older men use ore, and it might come off as arrogant or self-confident. Gojo was using ore while being in school still, essentially thinking highly of himself. Boku is the more respectful term, and Gojo switches to its usage after Geto's defection, which further feeds into the aforementioned idea of Gojo clinging to Geto's philosophies. When he is faced with Kenjaku in Geto's body just before being sealed in the prison realm, he briefly reverts to ore once more, and in his final moments when he is surrounded by loved ones, he uses ore once again. Based on all of these points, we can attach ore to Gojo's humanity, his high school days, his blue spring, the only time of his life where he wasn't burdened by being the sole strongest. And we can attach Boku to the inverse, every other point in his life where he was simply a cog in Jujutsu society. Being killed by Ryomen Sukuna wasn't a tragedy for Satoru Gojo. The way he sees it, it's actually rather beautiful. The lotus lily imagery used when Gojo speaks about how he'd been misunderstood for all his life is heavily associated with rebirth in Japanese culture. But this isn't some kind of hint that Gojo will be resurrected and reborn once more. There's a reason why this scene is almost the exact inverse of his Honored One moment in Hidden Inventory. Instead of reaching for the sun and proclaiming himself as the sole strongest, Satoru grounds himself. He lowers himself. He accepts that he isn't special. Not anymore. He's just another human, and he's happy for that. The absolute strongest, the loneliness that follows, he'd been consumed by that feeling for so long, so he is grateful that somebody like Sukuna, who could share in that feeling and understand him, finally came along. Somebody like Geto, who breaks down the walls that separate Gojo from the rest of human existence, who allow him to finally be understood. That is the tragic tale of Satoru Gojo, the man who only ever wanted an equal, somebody to cure the loneliness that comes with unparalleled strength. And that is why I find his death to be very beautiful. For the first time in his life, Gojo suffered an overwhelming and absolute defeat. He was completely outmatched. Sukuna isn't like Toji, who used underhanded methods and cursed tools against an already much weaker version of Gojo. This is the king of curses, the strongest sorcerer in history, fighting against Gojo at his absolute peak. Mahoraga wasn't a problem for Gojo in combat. We saw just how effortlessly he handled the Shikigami. Instead, Mahoraga served the role of a manual, something Sukuna used for his own evolution. Gojo even flat out states Sukuna was not depending on this tactic, that he could have won just as well if he used his own techniques. And so, at the end of it all, Gojo can't help but feel satisfied despite losing, and despite what his death might lead to for the future of humanity. All his life he'd been focused on the well-being of others, the responsibility that comes with his strength. I think we can give him just one moment, at his deathbed, his final moment, to focus on himself, to be happy alongside his best friend. I think the thematic backbone of Jujutsu Kaisen thus far, with regards to the ideas of strength, bonds, agency, and how they all tie together, is rather concerning. This is a story about humanity. It was triggered by a series of very human decisions. And so the implications of Sukuna, a human turned curse, being the benchmark of JJK's philosophies, is very worrying. The embodiment of selfishness and hedonism, somehow being rewarded for his actions. Characters like Gojo and Yuki suffering for the inverse. Even though this is a very rough summation of JJK's themes, it is definitely not the kind of message you'd expect from a shonen manga, or any story at that. And that's why I think what comes next is going to be incredibly crucial for Gojo's character. The new generation of monsters he placed his stocks in will pave the way for a new philosophy. Yuji Itatori, front and center. The boy who has always thrived when working with others. In his first encounter with Mahito, Yuji is getting cooked. He puts up a good fight against Choso, but in the end, he loses. Higuruma would have probably also cooked him if not for Yuji confessing to the crime he didn't commit. These are all 1v1s, and Yuji is always on the back foot. But then you look at how effective he is when fighting alongside others. They bounce off of each other and maximize the other's strength. Together with Nanami, he overwhelms Mahito. Together with Nobara, they defeat the death paintings. Together with Todo, they handle Hanami. And most importantly, together with Todo, he defeats Mahito. Todo's philosophy is one of the most interesting in the story because it exists in direct opposition to Sukuna's philosophy. He believes that sorcerers are simply a part of a bigger picture, that they exist as a piece of a greater whole. The cog mentality, but spun in a positive light. The only reason they managed to defeat Mahito is because Yuji and Todo worked together. Had either of them tried to take him on alone, they would have suffered. Sukuna preaches that flocking together is a weakness, but Yuji will prove him wrong and give way to a new philosophy, to understand one's role and execute that to the extent of your capabilities. That is where I believe the story of Jujutsu Kaisen is heading, at least thematically. The new Jujutsu society that Satoru Gojo lived to create.